let's flash forward. Your president, Bernie Sanders, is still active in the Senate. He manages to get Medicare for All through the Senate in some compromised version, the Elizabeth Warren version or other version. Nancy Pelosi gets a version of it through the House of Representatives. It comes to your desk. Do you veto it?
I would veto anything that delays providing the security and the certainty of health care being available now. If they got that through and by some miracle, there was an epiphany that occurred, and some miracle occurred that said, okay, it's passed, then you got to look at the cost. I want to know, how did they find the $35 trillion? What is that doing? Is it going to significantly raise taxes on the middle class, which it will? What's going to happen? Look, my opposition isn't to the principle that you should have Medicare. I mean, everybody, health care should be a right in America. My opposition relates to whether or not, A, it's doable, two, what the cost is, and what the consequences for the rest of the budget are. How are you going to find $35 trillion over the next 10 years without having profound impacts on everything from taxes for middle class and working class people, as well as the impact on the rest of the budget?
So did we get an answer there from Biden about whether or not he would sign a Medicare for All bill if he were president of the United States? If the Senate managed, if the Congress managed to pass what Bernie Sanders wants them to, says he wants them to, would Biden sign it? No, you got this rambling, I got to talk about the cost and this, and it's, not going to raise taxes, and it is going to raise taxes. And why not just say, no, I would veto that? Why not just say that? Be clear. I think Bernie Sanders is right when he says, and this is not just about the Medicare for All question, it's about everything. People deserve clear answers from Joe Biden on everything now. The Democrats should insist that he speaks with precision, such as he can, about all this stuff. Play clip 5.
I think Joe was somewhere in, where was he? I don't know, Michigan or someplace else the other day, and he spoke for 7 minutes. I don't know how you say anything other than, minimal discussion in 7 minutes. So all that I have always believed is that if we believe in democracy, a candidate has got to be honest with the people about what he or she believes, given the many, many challenges facing our country. And when you do that, when you're honest and you look at the hard issues, so you're going to take on the fossil fuel industry or Wall Street or the drug companies, it brings forth opposition. I know that. I get beaten up every day. That's fine. That's what I do. But all I would say is, I'm not going to criticize Joe, but to say that I think the American people in this incredibly complicated and difficult moment in our history are entitled to thoughtful answers to the crises we face.
Not going to get them from Joe Biden, that's for sure. Yeah, I was there and Corn Pop was looking at my legs and I had the blonde hair on the legs from the sun and I took out a razor, but it was rusty. And I said, hey, Corn Pop, I'm from Delaware, but sometimes I like to sound like I'm from South Carolina for no apparent reason. And I just wanted it. That's what you're going to get from Joe Biden. That's where this is all heading. The media is going to cover from as much as possible. One big decision that they're going to have to make, and I mean the Biden campaign is going to have to make, is do they try to just hide him from the public whenever they can and do a lot of very scripted and produced and safe environment stuff for Joe Biden, politically safe environment stuff for Joe Biden, or are they going to let him go around? I mean, we have the audio of it. You can't really hear, but he really gets into it with some union workers at a plant in Michigan. And I've listened to the audio. It's not good enough to play for you because there's too much ambient noise. You can't really, if you can see him, you can make it out, but over radio it wouldn't translate. But first of all, he says he says something about taking away AR-14s. I'm sorry, you're not allowed to talk about gun control and how you want to take away people's weapons that are legally owned and that are protected under the Second Amendment. You're not allowed to talk about that, or you shouldn't be allowed to talk about that, unless you know what it is you're trying to take away. There should be a pretty basic rule of thumb here that you're only going to take away weapons from people if you know what the weapons are. If you're a politician and you want to outlaw something, you should know what you're outlawing. All right? There's no AR-14 problem in America. But this is another place where you see liberals as part of their hatred of those who own guns, liberals are willing to be contemptuous of facts about guns. They don't really care. It does not really matter to them that they don't understand what they're talking about, because they just know guns are icky, guns are bad, bad people like guns. And so that's why Joe Biden, who talks about this issue, and he talks about, saving lives with gun control and all this, virtue signaling. I mean, if you were able to remove, and I mean this as a general proposition, as a general rule, if you could take the feeling of one's own ego being stroked by saying certain things about politics, by taking certain political positions, 75% of the Democrat Party's platform, I think, would just evaporate overnight. Democrats pretend to care so much about the poor. These people don't care about the poor more than anybody else. Democrats pretend to care so much about minorities. They only care about minorities insofar as they can count on minority votes come election time, and then use that power for their own purposes. Democrats pretend. You get on the list, all these things. Oh, they're the ones that really care. They're the ones that really care. And as part of that, they always have to assume that people on the right, conservatives, we don't care, which is among the most maddening, among the most frustrating lies that are constant in our politics. An example of this is around coronavirus. I can't tell you how many people, how many libs, leftists in my Twitter feed seem to think that I just don't care about what happens to America with coronavirus because I'm so in favor of the Trump administration. I'm sitting here, I'm like, that's just a stupid lie. If this thing gets out of control, and if the Trump administration is responsible for bad decision making, or if we can really point to something and say they messed up on this, I'm going to come out here, I'm going to say it, and I'm going to be upset with them, and I'm going to think there should be accountability, and that accountability is going to come this fall, right? But I'm not going to get ahead of that and play their game and trash Trump when he hasn't done anything wrong, and when right now the crisis, at least in America, seems to be, for now, could change tomorrow, seems to be under control in as much as it can be, right? But they assume the bad faith. The same thing with climate change. Oh, I don't care about future generations. I don't care about clean air because I'm like paid off by the oil industry or something. These people are morons. I mean, Bernie Sanders said, the bad guys that he's always attacking are fossil fuels, Wall Street, and drug companies. Fossil fuel is what our economy runs on. It's how working class people get to work. It's how they have jobs. It's in the products they buy. Fossil fuels are the economy in the modern world. We are slowly transitioning out of that as efficiencies increase for other technologies. Nuclear would be the single best one, but the libs convince themselves that there's going to be like green radioactive goo that destroys the planet if we have too many nuclear facilities, right? So they shove that aside. They're always wrong on energy stuff. They've been reliably wrong on energy, fossil fuel, and other energy for the last 50 years, but we're supposed to listen to them now and have the finger wagging in our face about how we're all bought off by the fossil fuel industry. And they just have stupid arguments about this. But it's because they believe in this climate change catastrophe scenario that's just not real. And one day we'll be able to talk about this, and they'll just say, oh, no, we were trying to push us into this better future, and it was worth it even if we were a little bit off in our calculations to try and push the world. They're never going to admit that they were wrong on this, but we'll know that they're wrong. I mean, I will be an adult, and I'll be talking to you at some point in the future about how they've been totally wrong on climate change, and they won't admit it, and here we are. They were wrong all along, and they still think they should get a trophy and a pat on the back. So, and then we got the drug companies, and I think this is interesting because in the last hour I was talking to you about the border and how there hasn't been enough of a focus on the importance of border security at a time of a pandemic like this, and the importance of travel restrictions. Remember, the libs took Trump all the way to the Supreme Court on the travel ban, the so-called Muslim ban, and it is that same executive authority that he used to stop the flights coming in from China, which may very well end up having saved, who knows, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of lives. But the libs opposed that, even though it was very clear in the statutory, in this statutory language that the president does have that authority as the commander in chief. They pretended he didn't. And then they came up with some, just insane cockamamie reason why they said it was because he was, they didn't like what he said on the campaign trail when he's running for president. It has nothing to do with anything, but that was their claim. It was absurd, but they'll twist the law in any way they can if it suits their purposes, right? So the president has done that. But also, we've reached this point where we're now really focused on the science around all of this. And before I'm going to take a pause here, because before I get into science and the drug companies and all that, I want to start with something else. Bernie Sanders made a claim at the town hall, the Fox town hall yesterday, that I'm going to have to dive into. And it's the classic socialist lie, the biggest lie of all, which is that socialism is not really socialism. You know that that saying? I remember it from the Usual Suspects movie, that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world that he didn't exist. Right? That's what the Kaiser Soze character, spoiler alert, says at the end of the movie. The greatest trick that socialism pulls is that it keeps convincing people that after it fails, it wasn't really socialism. Bernie Sanders tried that once again.
Hi, Senator. As someone from Russia, a country that was greatly impacted by the negative effects of socialism, what assurances can you offer myself and other people impacted by socialism that democratic socialism will not have the same results?
Good. Thank you for the question, Martha. Martha? Margaret. Okay. What happened and existed in the Soviet Union was not socialism.
That would definitely be news to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. That would be news to them. It would be news to the founders of the Soviet Union, who all spent decades in the socialist underground, not just in what then became the Soviet Union, but in Germany, in the UK, in Switzerland, bouncing all around Europe, spreading the poison of socialist ideology. It would be news to them. It would be news to a young Yosef Zhugashvili from Georgia, who in early days of his adult life was self-describing as a social democrat. That's right. Not even just a socialist, a social democrat, right along with Bernie Sanders. It would be a fascinating experiment, or it would really prove the point about Bernie Sanders' politics if we could just ask him to explain what was wrong in the Soviet Union? Why did socialism go bad? I would love to hear, and if somebody really drilled down on it, because I don't think he would be able to answer the question. He would have to dodge. He'd have to weave around. He'd just start saying, Sweden, Sweden's great. Look at Sweden. But Sweden is not a socialist country. It's a country with a large welfare state, high taxation, a large social welfare system, but actually has an economy that runs on free market principles and in some ways is more corporate friendly and more free market friendly than America is. Same thing with Denmark. So I would like to have somebody ask Bernie Sanders, well, why was the Soviet Union not socialist? In fact, most people would argue that the most pure distillation of socialist principles ever were, in fact, the founding ideals of the Soviet Union. I mean, they wanted true radical equality. That was at least what they started out with. As we know, this then morphed into a class of elites who were living a completely separate and much more luxurious, although not even that luxurious really, because they had such crappy standard of living in the Soviet Union because they couldn't produce anything. But we know that it all fell apart. It turned into a nightmare. It turned into a massive slave state, essentially, where everybody was working for the state, and this state employees became their overlords, and it was tyrannical and totalitarian. I wonder if Bernie Sanders, somebody should ask him, have you read the great anti-Soviet works? I can guarantee you Bernie Sanders has not read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. Guarantee it. I can guarantee you Bernie Sanders has not read if you want to bring it into the American context, Whittaker Chambers' witness. I'm sure he has read the Communist Manifesto and a bunch of those origin documents, if you will, for communism and socialism, but he doesn't really understand, because he's a true believer. He doesn't really understand why these things have failed. He does, because if he understood why they've failed, then he would have to admit that there is a common thread in all these socialist systems that is always the problem. That there is a group that thinks they have the answers, they have the plan, you often call it in socialist analysis, the plan, and the plan must be instituted by the state to create equality and better living conditions for everyone according to this plan, and they need force and authority to be able to do that. And in doing so, they eliminate freedom, they take away individual choice, they remove signals from the market, most importantly price, which is just individuals interacting freely with one another to their own benefit. It ignores human nature, which is rooted in self-interest, and assumes that the group or the class or the political party of experts implementing the plan know what they're doing, have the best interests of the people at heart, and understand how to implement this plan, and will respond when to failures with better ideas. It always fails. There's a common theme to all of us. It always starts to collapse. And even in Sweden was much more socialist in the 60s and 70s than it is now, because they couldn't sustain the social welfare state that they had. So it really is this theory that, we can be just like Sweden. Well, okay, and if you want to be like Sweden, what you're really saying is just raise taxes a lot on the middle class, and you can go to mediocre colleges that no one else anywhere in the world wants to go to, because that's what Sweden has, and you can have like reasonable health care until you're old and they don't want to spend the money on you, and then you're on your own. But you're going to pay 60% in taxes, those you make in 30, 40, 50, 60 grand, 60% in taxes. That's what Sweden is. It's not this paradise that Bernie Sanders pretends it is. All right? There's a reason why, except for people from the third world and from, refugee status who want to go to Sweden because it has a large welfare state. So yeah, better to be on welfare in Sweden than be in a refugee camp in Syria, fine. But, you're noticing like the rest of the world isn't rushing to go live in Sweden. There are reasons for that. The rest of the first world isn't like, yeah, sign me up. I want to go and try to hack it out in Stockholm. And, and ultimately it's also, I don't want America to be Sweden. So even Bernie Sanders' ultimate explanation here is completely not compelling for me, but he does not understand the reasons why socialism fails. And that's why, and I think that's actually a von Mises, is it von Mises or Hayek, Why Socialism Fails? Another good one to read, Why Socialism Fails. He doesn't understand. And he doesn't want to understand, because it would be effectively a repudiation of what he's been pushing for his entire life. I actually got mixed up there for a second. If you want to read Why Socialism Fails, it's an essay. You can see it at the Hoover Institute. But Hayek wrote The Fatal Conceit, The Errors of Socialism. So these are all, and there's a lot of stuff from Ludwig von Mises. This is the Austrian School of Economics. They all understand that these were all this was a bad idea. It makes people feel good when they talk about it, but that's really a description of Bernie Sandersism. He says things that make you think he has your best interest at heart, and it feels good to say, but it will not work, and it will lead to disaster. Hayek is so much great stuff. Collectivist economic planning, Socialism and War, The Errors of Socialism. But the single greatest book ever written by F.A. Hayek is The Road to Serfdom, which it's a little dense. It's not like fun beach reading, but don't even give me von Mises or producer Nick. We could sit around and talk about this. You try to get through von Mises, it's like trying to wade through a swamp in neck-deep water. It's really slow going, man. Von Mises is not an easy read. But the fundamental philosophy that they expand upon of free markets, free individuals, what creates prosperity, they're right. Capitalism is a better system, and that Bernie Sanders is running around advocating for socialism is not only it's not only it's a bad idea for the country, but I want the country to know why it's a bad idea, right? So defeating it at the ballot box in the Democrat primary is not enough. We need to never be back at a place where the American people have their children, which is what's going on right now, about 60% of whom think that socialism is better than capitalism. It is not. Socialism is flawed state planning with force that does not achieve the goals that it seeks to achieve and suppresses dissent because the plan is the single most important thing. And this is where you get into how socialist regimes, especially if they come into being through revolution or through a coup, anybody that has a problem with what they're doing, they just shout them down and say, we're trying to achieve radical equality here. You're a counter-revolutionary. That became the primary charge used in the Soviet Union, not only because the Soviet Union became a place where they were eating their own all the time. At first, it started out with they went for the intellectuals, and then they went for the nobility, and then they went for university students, and they went for property owners, and then they started clearing out all the other socialists. The Bolsheviks started clearing out all the other socialists, the Mensheviks, the social revolutionaries. There are all these different factions of socialists that came to power during the Russian Revolution, and then there was the liquidation of those because it was all about consolidation of power by the Bolsheviks, which is really just consolidation by a group that then became one person, Joseph Stalin. And over time, that is in fact what happened. And you even had the Soviets track down some of their initial heroes, like Trotsky, who ended up with an ice axe in the back of his head in Mexico City, at the hands of the Soviets, because they wanted to eliminate anybody that realized that this revolution. They always will say the revolution has been hijacked. That's what it's a version of, socialism isn't real socialism. The revolution was hijacked. No, when you empower people to make decisions for other people and based on your belief in the infallibility of your ideals, that you are no longer accountable to those people and what you do to them in using the power you have because you're trying to achieve something greater, that is where the tyrannical hand of socialism shows itself. Again, Bernie Sanders just does not know this. And that he would try to get away with this old dodge that the Soviet Union wasn't socialism is absurd. And you might say, well, Buck, it's communism, right? Well, communism is merely a branch of socialism that takes socialism to its logical ends, right? You need to have a group of people. If you're really going to do this thing, if you're really going to have radical equality, you're going to have a group of people that are making these decisions to institute the plan. And if you're a true class warrior, you're going to tell everybody that all their needs will be met, but everybody's going to be the same. And to do that, you have to suppress individual ingenuity. You have to forget that individuals have different levels of gifts. Individuals have different skills and work ethic and honor and decency. And, all these, we have all these different traits, all these different things that we either develop or that, quite honestly, we're born with in some cases. And we're not all the same. Socialism, communism seeks to make us all the same. And to have the power to even try to do that is, well, putting us all on a road to serfdom, borrow from Hayek. That's what ends up happening. The state controls you. The state owns you because they've got this better idea. And this is why it leads to disaster. I also think that Sanders doesn't have any familiarity with the Great Purge. He does not understand Soviet history. He has not read Robert Conquest. As I mentioned, he has not read Solzhenitsyn. I don't think that Bernie has an understanding of Dostoevsky. And then this is a guy that went to the Soviet Union basically for his honeymoon, right? So and he's been talking about the Soviet Union for a very long time. He doesn't understand. He doesn't know. He still believes the initial propaganda that the Soviets were using. Remember, Soviets were little collectives. And they were little councils. That's why when I saw Occupy Wall Street and the people doing the sort of twinkly fingers thing and all these different community organizer groups coming together and talking about direct democracy, a lot of that rhetoric of just groups of councils of people coming together to make all the decisions and their overriding ethos was about radical equality. That's very similar to what you had in the early days of the Soviet is a commune. There were Soviets all over even before the Soviet Union came together, and it was a council of people, a council of socialists. That's what a Soviet is. And then all these different councils got consolidated into the Bolshevik Soviet, and then guess what? They're like, we're just going to run everything now. Thank you. It's been fun. It was nice to pretend that you guys were all going to get a say in things, but if you get in the way, you're a counter-revolutionary. You have to be destroyed. I've been rereading recently, which is probably why it's front of mind, the Gulag Archipelago. I've said to you before that Orwell's 1984 is the most important English language book written in the 20th century, which I think is definitely a strong case. Now, you can argue with that. You can say, no, there's something else. That's fine. But I think there's a strong case to be made that 1984 is the most important English language book of the 20th century. Gulag Archipelago is definitely in the top 5, and it may be number 2. Road to Serfdom might actually be in the top 5 as well. But Gulag Archipelago is something that you have to read to really understand how the system and why people like me have such an aversion to government authority, government power, the bureaucracy, thinking that the experts always know better, thinking that if only you give these government figures more time and more authority, they'll be able to fix all the problems. They're wrong. All right, so what is the latest on the coronavirus, the outbreak response in this country? You've got a few dozen who have died from this. They are, I think, exclusively people who are over the age of 70, which is right in line with the high-risk population assessments that everyone has been talking about all along. But we have to protect our seniors. We have to protect people who are older because this disease is particularly dangerous to them, and that's really where the focus should be of our efforts of in terms of medical care and preventing the spread of it. Interestingly enough, the Trump administration has been getting so much. I mean, you have a lot of this. You have a lot of like Nicole Wallace, who is I don't know who at MSNBC likes her or thinks that she should have a TV show. I honestly just don't understand why. She's a deeply unimpressive person in every respect. Says very reckless and dumb things on television on a regular basis. I don't get it, but she does. If you're a former Republican who all you do is trash Republicans now, I think that's such a gross place for people to be. I mean, I know everyone's got to make a living. Everyone's got a mortgage to pay and all that, but there are better ways to do it than to turn on what you, as an adult, claim to have been fighting for your whole life, right? And then you just sell it all out because you want a paycheck from MSNBC. But Wallace said she's indicative of the kind of stuff you're hearing right now when it comes to criticism about the Trump administration's response. Play 20, producer Mark.
So this is one of those things that I wish we were wrong about, people who are critical and who see the flaws. This is one of those ones where when Donald Trump says, oh, a miracle is going to take Corona away, that's like the one in a million things where I'm like, oh, I wish he were right. Yeah. But the problem, and look, here's the other thing. I mean, we have a global pandemic and he's liar, pants on fire president. Who saw this coming? I mean, this was where it was always going to land. Right. We were always going to need him to have more credibility on the world stage, to level with us, and to be more competent than he is when our health and our family's health was on the line. And sadly, it took something like this, I think, to even shake the confidence of some members of his base. The virus doesn't have a political affiliation.
That's a perfect distillation of what the lib politicized message is about the Trump response. Yeah, we were maybe like wrong about all the other things about like Russia collusion and whatever. Like we won't admit that, but like clearly like that hasn't worked. But like now we're finally here. This time we mean it. Like Donald Trump is like so bad at taking care of coronavirus that and so now they're finally, this time it's different. This time it's unavoidable that he's, and I sit around thinking, what exactly is they keep saying he's lied about this. They say this all the time. I mean, it actually, and I know some people said when this came up on the Bill Maher show, I should have just, drilled into this and really started shouting back when they were yelling over me and everything else. How do you argue with somebody who just thinks that all they have to do is say that Trump lies, and if you ask them about what, they just start yelling louder. Trump lies! Trump lies! That's it. What does he lied about? Because if they tell you what the lies are, then you can actually push back and say, hold on a second, he's not. You really think that he's calling this a hoax? He has meetings about it every day. And he never says it's a hoax in the meetings. Public forums where he's discussing this. He's giving press conferences about this thing. Never says it's a hoax. But you're just going to walk around saying he's called it a hoax? That's a stupid thing, right? That's a dumb thing to say. They've tried that, but they will shout, he lies. It is a bit like having, and I really mean this, Democrats in the era of Trump, it's a little bit like sitting down with somebody who is emotionally disturbed and says that there is a bad man at my window. And you say, no, I'm here with you. I'm looking at your window. There's no one out there. We're on the 10th floor. There's no one at your window. There's no bad man at the window. And they look at you and they get mad. Yes, there is. There's a bad man at my window. That is debating Democrats in the era of Trump. What do you do? How do you win that argument? There isn't a bad man at the window. What are you talking about? Yes, there is. Well, what has Trump not done well about, or what has Trump not done to the satisfaction of liberals in terms of action around coronavirus? He lies. Okay. What does that mean? What has he lied about that has affected the response to coronavirus? You won't get an answer. In fact, Gavin Newsom, who's generally a rather slimy and dishonest political character, but look, balls and strikes, it's a promise I always make to you. I call it like it is. And when someone says the right thing, I say it's the right thing. When someone does a good thing, I say that too, even if I think they're generally terrible. This is what Gavin Newsom said about President Trump's assistance and communication to the state of California to deal with this. Play clip 1.
Over the past couple of days, President Trump has said that he would prefer if none of the passengers aboard these cruises landed on U.S. soil. Did he mention any of that to you in your conversation?
Yeah, we had a private conversation, but he said we're going to do the right thing, and you have my support, all of our support, logistically and otherwise. So before he made those statements publicly, I had a private conversation with him around 4:30 West Coast time, and he said everything that I could have hoped for. And we had a very long conversation, and every single thing he said, they followed through on. So I'm just not interested in finding daylight on those statements, because every single thing his administration, and it starts at the top, including the vice president, has been consistent with the expectation that we repatriate these passengers, and we do it in a way that does justice to the spirit that defines the best of our country and the state of California.
I mean, give the man credit for that. That was a fair-minded statement. How many politicians have you heard of, like Governor Inslee from Washington, like a jerk after Pence called him to see how things were going up there, because Washington's been hit really hard by coronavirus so far, a lot of fatalities there. Like a jerk, Inslee goes on Twitter to make fun of Pence and the administration right after they're trying to help him out. And people say, oh, see, he's calling out no, he's being an idiot. Look, Gavin Newsom, I think, is wrong and terrible on a whole lot of things, but here his tone here and his response when the media is trying to bait him into trashing Trump because of the princess, what's it called? The princess something cruise, whatever it is. Diamond Princess, is that right? Anyway, yeah, whatever. Producer Mark is our cruise expert. Yeah, they would talk about the cruise, and that was a Trump moment, right? Trump goes, look, I wish they didn't have to land here. It just means our numbers are going to go up. And everyone's, oh, look what he said about that, and he's crazy. Look, he's just being Trump. He was just sort of speaking off the cuff. He didn't mean anything. Coordinated with California, they dealt with it properly. Everything was done well. But see, this is where there's a huge disconnect between libs, the left, and those of us that appreciate what President Trump has been doing, not just on coronavirus, but in general. I look at what he does and what the impact of it is. They look at how he said the thing that he was going to do. Like, what were the words around the issue, right? It would be kind of like if I was sitting here and I had a relative that was about to have heart surgery, and before the heart surgery, the doctor comes up to me and he's like, yeah, sometimes you got to pull out a heart and make it beat, and you got to put it back in, and bada bing, bada boom. And I was like, oh my gosh, did you hear? Well, if he goes in there and he does a perfect heart surgery, and my relative is now going to live 10 or 15 years longer because of it, do I care how he talked about it beforehand? Why am I supposed to care? This is the separation that libs and the left have from the rest of us on Trump. And they act like we're crazy because we say, okay, he did the right thing. Why do you keep trying? Because they want to be right so badly about him. Because to have to walk back all the things they've said about Trump and he's a traitor and Russia and all this stuff, it's just too much. It's too much for their egos to bear. When people's egos are involved, it makes everything a whole lot more complicated. And the left's collective, I like using that word for them, the left's collective ego is completely invested in Trump being terrible. And so they'll never walk that back. They'll never tone that down, because it would mean that they've been wrong this whole time and that they've been irresponsible in what they've been saying and how they've been assessing this president. So that's my my sense of that with Gavin Newsom. I mean, you know, he said exactly the right thing, which is that they did the right stuff by us, and I'm not going to play this game right now. Now, tomorrow Newsom will probably say something terrible about the administration, but in that soundbite, I was like, oh, wow, he can be reasonable.